So right now it's my turn to kind of start a conversation, and this one actually I'm going over with Full Metal Alchemist, one of the most popular series in general. That's not necessarily not as long as the popularity would state. So originally it's only 116 chapters with 27 volumes in total, and then both of the active elements of the story, I believe they were both 52 episodes in length. Yeah, okay, so it was 64 for the Brotherhood remake and then 51 for the original. And this is one of those examples where they actively did have a very different story. For starters, when they did Full Metal Alchemist, they didn't fully make the story follow the original series. Now, there was a good episode of Gintama where they explained how filler actively goes into the actual anime, in that it's designed to give them a break to kind of like let the manga continue on into like a good point in time where they can resume the series and not overcome it. But they also just noted that there were some downsides to doing filler, in that the filler in and of itself could just destroy the anime in general and cause it to end. The while the filler's going, the manga could end, and then they'd have to figure out how to end it there, because most likely where they left off at a point where the manga was, they were caught up to them. There's also the possibility that, based on how the manga could write, like depending on, I know that there are certain mangakas in the actual industry that take a very long time to write their volumes. I believe Takahiro Inoue is a really good example. The person who wrote Real, he's currently writing Vagabond. A lot of cases, his volumes take very long to come out. And this is not exactly, you can't say that, oh, it's because it's a morning comic. Morning comes out it comes out 2 times a month. Or that it's one of those cases where it continues on. But this is kind of beside the point. In this case, it followed the third pattern where the filler became the actual story. And I have to say that I actually like it more than Brotherhood. Now, this is not necessarily something that I see a lot. Necessarily, because when you look at Full Metal Alchemist in general, you see a lot of people who like the original series, and I'll be very, very honest. I understand why. It's a very good story, very compelling characters, and it also brings up some very interesting points of view, mainly based on the idea of the human transmutation. I could cover that in another video, but for now, what I kind of want to go over is the fact that, in general, the story of Full Metal Alchemist differs for the ways that I like it. Differing are 2 specific ones. The minor one is specifically for the darker storyline. It's during kind of like in the timeline. It's very light-hearted in the original, but there's enough darkness in the actual thing. Main characters losing their mother, trying to bring her back only to realize that the price was way too high. And also the fact that there's, in both stories, there's a conspiracy, but the conspiracy is less, it's more, I guess you could say, subtle in the original than compared to Brotherhood. So, like, specifically on the original, you have Dante, the main antagonist, who not necessarily created all the alchemists, but fed them their food source to make them into who they are. And her main claim to fame is that she wants immortality. That's what the Philosopher's Stone is going to offer her. As opposed to Brotherhood, Father's main goal is to become God. And I feel like becoming God or becoming all powerful, usually that one feels a lot more common. And I'm not a big fan of things that are common. But those two things are kind of beside the point. The main thing that I like is the homunculus. So specifically, if you take Lust, is a good example of a character that was not necessarily done wrong by the series, but had a very different change. So Lust specifically is embodiment of lust. She's enough of a character to change the direction of people's goals simply because of who she is. So like Roy, in reference to Havoc, I can see why you fell for her. You're a sucker for big boobs. But there's a very different storyline between these two. Like, Lust, and to an extent, all of the other homunculi in Brotherhood are simply Father removing his humanity from him, his sins, the 7 deadly sins. So every single homunculi is the exact same in that sense. They are just an aspect of Father that he no longer wanted because he no longer wanted to be considered human. But in the original, every single homunculi was actually created through the human transmutation. So it actively made the human transmutation more, I feel, more connected to the story. Because it's not that the human transmutation actually failed. It's that it created something that wasn't human. And that's actively what I think of with all of them. But it's also the fact that Lust, they all want, in the original series, they all want to become human again. Because they actively know, instinctually, I guess, is that they are on some level human. Now, in the Brotherhood version, they're created from a supreme, I guess, a demi-supreme being. So they obviously have the superiority complex over humans. They don't see any reason to utilize anything more than that. But the other thing is that Lust in Brotherhood is the second one to die and the first one to die permanently. Because you did actually have, I'll get to Greed in a second, but as opposed to in Full Metal, the original one, I think she was actually the second one to die, but she actually lasted much longer than that. Granted, in the original Full Metal Alchemist, you actively had 3 of them survive the entire series and only die in the movie. But it's also the fact that she realized that her master was using her just to gain what she wanted, and so she struck out on her own, struck out with the Elric brothers, and that's how she died. Whereas in the actual anime, it's just she died kind of like as a mid-boss. And I feel like that was taking someone who survived almost the entire series, only dying, I believe, what was it, 43, maybe 42 or 43? Let's see. And the other fact is that she's actually technically originally a human. In this case, the lover of Scar's brother, and that's how it ended up working. Envy is another example, and one of the examples that actively survived through the original series, whereas he was one of the main, I'd call him like one of the three big bads of the actual series, like in terms of what he did. He's just as bad as Father. He was able to turn pretty much everyone onto their heads. And he was able to do that in both, but he actually had more substance to the character, where the envy aspect was just that envy in Brotherhood. That's it. But in the original, he was the son of Van Hohenheim and Dante in their original first life, who actually died, I think, what was it, due to mercury poisoning, I think. So he actually had more substance to the character than just being a homunculus or a part of himself. Then you have the other thing is that they completely changed Wrath and Pride around. Or actually, no, I'm pretty sure it was Wrath, Sloth, and Pride. Where Wrath in the original one, or in Brotherhood, was specifically King Bradley. King Bradley was Pride in the original. I feel like I can't really speak much on terms of those, since both characters in general felt, I can't say the same, but it felt like the aspect of being Wrath versus the aspect of being Pride really didn't have much of a difference. You can say that because in the last one, in Wrath, he wasn't as wrathful than the original Wrath. Whereas the original Wrath was I believe it was stillborn son of Izumi Curtis, and also one of the newest made Homunculi. But in his case, he was angry not only at his mother for tearing him away from heaven, but also to the Elric brothers, who he gained Ed's arm and leg. Whereas in Brotherhood, nothing really happens to it aside from, so Truth gains it instead. Then you have Selim Bradley, Pride in Brotherhood. Again, I feel like I can't speak much because it's an odd comparison. But I think the best comparison is Sloth. Sloth in Brotherhood is a giant bulky guy who becomes really fast when he wants to use his effort. Whereas in the original, it's the transmuted version of the Elric's mother. Now, this one, in that sense, I don't understand personally why Sloth would have been that case. I would have thought that Wrath would have been more interesting in that sense, but Wrath was already taken, I guess. So then, if you do... But this was one of the best examples of a specific massive difference in terms of what it was, but it gave the Elrics proof that it was technically possible to make a human transmutation. It just won't go the way that they need it to. Probably the last thing but in general, I felt like the homunculi were done worse in Brotherhood than in the original. They felt more three-dimensional. They felt like their personalities had value outside of who they were. If you want to argue that they were simply following their sin, lust was following her lust sin, envy was envious, gluttony was was always hungry. It's fine to do that, but I'm just saying that I prefer my minor antagonists to be a little bit more interesting. Probably the other thing that I will say about the original anime is that they left it open at the end. Like, instead of having a happy ending where the main bad guy is defeated, all the most, if not all, the problems are solved. This was a country that just went to war, not only with everything around it, but in a sense with itself. So every single thing that they did should have been on a certain level changed. So what I see is the aspect of adding that open-ended ending to it. Edward sacrificing himself to bring back Alphonse, and being transported to another world where alchemy doesn't exist. The also thing is the three of the homunculi actually surviving. In this case, it was Wrath losing his arm, the human arm and leg, and in exchange gaining the automail that Ed was supposed to get. Then we have Gluttony, who instead of being devoured by pride, was instead devoured by himself. Kind of ironic if we think about it. And then there's also Envy, who followed Ed and Van into the other world and became the sacrifice to open the gate from Shambhala to the original world, or the real world to the original world, or whatever you want to call it. But I prefer that to being the open-ended. And this is actually kind of tying into the idea of movies. In general, movies are filler or non-canon, but they can actually become canon depending on how they're handled. I use the Full Metal Alchemist Conqueror of Shambhala as a very good example versus the Sacred Star of Milos. In Conqueror of Shambhala, this actively tries to tie whatever the knot remaining is from the original series, whereas the Sacred Star of Milos, and granted, I've never actually watched this movie before, but it's just extra filler. It's not it only adds to the story to add to the story. It doesn't tie any knots, or the knots that it ties are from its own plot line. So I'd like to hear everyone else's viewpoint on this. What do you think of the series? Do you think that Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is the better one? Or are you a supporter of the original? So thanks for listening.